December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor burns. America enters the war. But thousands of miles away from the smoke and chaos of the Pacific, 4 young soldiers received orders that would lead them into a mystery that would baffle investigators for 3/4 of a century. They were told to establish a remote observation post high in the rugged peaks of the Cascade Mountains. It should have been routine, a simple assignment lasting just a few weeks. Instead, they vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions that haunted the military for decades. Then, in 2016, a team of mountaineers made an impossible discovery. Hidden beneath layers of snow and ice, perfectly preserved by the mountain's brutal conditions, they found something that defied all logic. A military shelter untouched by time, containing equipment, personal belongings, and evidence that would finally reveal what happened to those 4 men during one of the most brutal winters on record. What they uncovered wasn't just the fate of 4 forgotten soldiers. It was proof of human endurance in the face of impossible odds, and a story of survival that no one saw coming. The discovery would rewrite military history and answer questions that families had carried for 75 years. But the truth they found was more incredible than anyone could have imagined. November 15, 1941. Staff Sergeant Michael Romano adjusted his pack one final time as he stood outside the military transport depot in Tacoma, Washington. At 28, he was the oldest of the group, a career soldier from Detroit who'd enlisted during the Depression when jobs were scarce and the military offered steady pay. His weathered hands had seen action in the Philippines, and his squad respected his quiet authority. Romano had volunteered for this assignment, drawn by the promise of extra pay and the chance to serve his country in a new way. Beside him, Corporal James Henderson bounced nervously on his feet. At 22, Henderson was the radio specialist, a farm boy from Nebraska whose natural talent with communications equipment had earned him rapid promotion. His letters home described the assignment as an adventure, a chance to serve in the mountains he'd only seen in magazines. He'd promised his sweetheart Mary that he'd be back by Christmas. The ring he'd bought for her sat safely in his footlocker back at base. Private First Class. Anthony Kowalski stood apart from the group, methodically checking his gear with the precision that had made him the unit's best marksman. The son of Polish immigrants from Chicago, Kowalski was known for his dry humor and his ability to hit targets others couldn't even see. At 20, he was the youngest of the 4, but his steady nerves and sharp eyes made him invaluable for observation duties. The 4th member of their team was Private David Chen, whose presence in the unit was both remarkable and controversial. One of the few Chinese-American soldiers in the Pacific Northwest Division, Chen had faced discrimination from some quarters, but his skills as a medic and his fluency in multiple languages had earned him respect among those who mattered. Born in Seattle's Chinatown, he'd grown up hiking the very mountains they were now being sent to monitor. Their orders were classified but straightforward. The military had identified several strategic observation points along the Cascade Range where small teams could monitor for potential enemy activity. With tensions rising in the Pacific, coastal defenses were being strengthened, and these mountain posts would serve as early warning stations for any aerial threats approaching from the west. Colonel William Hayes briefed them personally, his gruff voice echoing in the small command room. The assignment was expected to last 4 to 6 weeks. They would be resupplied every 2 weeks by pack mule, weather permitting. Their mission was to observe and report, nothing more. They were not to engage any potential threats, merely document and radio their findings back to base. The location they'd been assigned was designated Observation Post Charlie, situated at an elevation of 7,200 feet on a remote ridge system approximately 40 miles northeast of Mount Rainier. The area was accessible only by a treacherous hiking trail that wound through dense forest and across exposed rock faces. No civilian settlements existed within 20 miles of their position. Their equipment list was extensive: military-issue tents designed for extreme weather, sleeping bags rated for sub-zero temperatures, a portable radio transmitter, signal flares, medical supplies, and enough food rations for 6 weeks. They carried rifles, ammunition, and a single Thompson submachine gun for emergency defense. Each man's pack weighed nearly 80 pounds when fully loaded. Weather reports indicated the coming winter would be harsh, but not unprecedented. The team had trained for cold weather operations, and all 4 men were experienced in wilderness survival. The military's confidence in their abilities was justified by their service records and specialized training. On November 18th, they began their ascent. The first day's hike covered 12 miles through old-growth forest, following a logging trail that had been abandoned years earlier. Henderson's radio crackled with regular check-ins, his voice cheerful and confident. Romano maintained their pace with military precision, calling brief halts every hour to rest and hydrate. By the second day, they'd climbed above the tree line, entering terrain dominated by exposed granite and sparse vegetation. The weather remained clear, though temperatures dropped significantly as they gained elevation. Chen treated minor altitude sickness in 2 of his teammates, administering oxygen and adjusting their pace accordingly. November 20th brought them within sight of their objective. The ridge system stretched before them like a massive stone spine, its peaks shrouded in clouds that promised snow. Romano selected their exact position based on optimal visibility and defensive positioning, a level area protected by rock formations, but offering clear sightlines in multiple directions. They established Observation Post Charlie with practiced efficiency. 2 tents were erected in a protected alcove between massive boulders, one for sleeping and one for equipment storage and radio operations. A camouflaged observation blind was constructed using natural materials and military netting, positioned to provide unobstructed views of the valleys below and the mountain passes to the west. Henderson established radio contact with base that evening, confirming their successful arrival and operational status. His transmission, logged at 1847 hours, was clear and professional. He reported favorable weather conditions, excellent visibility, and no unusual activity in their assigned observation area. For the first week, their routine was methodical and uneventful. Dawn observations began at 0500 hours, with 2-man shifts maintaining constant watch throughout daylight hours. Chen supplemented their rations with edible plants he identified from his childhood hiking experiences, while Kowalski proved invaluable at spotting wildlife and distinguishing between natural movement and potential threats. Romano maintained discipline with quiet authority, ensuring equipment was properly maintained and security protocols followed. He'd served in isolated posts before and understood the importance of routine in maintaining morale and effectiveness during extended deployments. The radio schedule called for twice daily check-ins at 0800 and 1800 hours. Henderson's transmissions were consistently professional, reporting weather conditions, visibility status, and any observations of note. Wildlife sightings, aircraft passing at high altitude, and the occasional distant smoke from logging operations were dutifully recorded and transmitted. November 26th marked their first encounter with severe weather. A Pacific storm system moved inland, bringing heavy rain that turned to sleet as temperatures dropped. The wind howled through the mountain passes with frightening intensity, and visibility dropped to near zero. Henderson's evening transmission was barely audible through the static, but he confirmed their position was secure and all personnel accounted for. The storm continued for 3 days, trapping the team in their shelters. Romano rationed their fuel carefully, knowing they couldn't afford to exhaust their heating supplies early in what promised to be a long winter deployment. The men passed time maintaining equipment, updating their observation logs, and sharing stories from home. By November 30th, the storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed by snow. The peaks around them gleamed white in the morning sun, and the valleys below were carpeted in pristine drifts. Kowalski marveled at the beauty while Chen worried about the implications for their scheduled resupply. The trail they'd used to reach their position was now buried under several feet of snow. Henderson's transmission that evening carried a note of concern. He reported that while their immediate area remained accessible, the approach route would be extremely difficult for pack animals. He requested confirmation of the resupply schedule and asked for updated weather forecasts. The response from base was reassuring. The resupply team was aware of the conditions and had contingency plans for winter operations. Weather reports suggested a brief warming trend in early December that would make the approach more manageable. The team was instructed to continue their mission as planned. December 3rd brought the last successful radio transmission from Observation Post Charlie. Henderson's voice was clear and professional as he delivered his routine report. Weather conditions were stable, visibility was excellent, and no unusual activity had been observed. He confirmed their supply situation was adequate and morale remained high. His final words were logged as, "All secure at OP Charlie. Next scheduled transmission, 0800 hours tomorrow." But December 4th brought only silence. At 0800 hours, radio operators at base waited for Henderson's familiar voice. Static filled the airwaves where his transmission should have been. Technical difficulties were common in mountain operations, so no immediate alarm was raised. Equipment failure, atmospheric interference, or temporary antenna damage could easily explain the missed contact. By 1800 hours, concern was growing. Henderson had never missed a scheduled transmission, and backup procedures called for emergency signals if primary communications failed. The silence was complete. No distress calls, no emergency beacon activations, nothing to indicate what might have happened at the remote observation post. December 5th arrived with clear skies and bitter cold temperatures. Colonel Hayes paced his office, studying weather reports and radio logs with growing unease. In his 20 years of military service, he'd learned to trust his instincts, and something about this silence felt wrong. Henderson was the most reliable radio operator in the division. Equipment failures happened, but not without some form of emergency communication. The decision to launch a search and rescue operation wasn't taken lightly. Winter conditions in the Cascades were notoriously dangerous, and committing additional personnel to the mountains carried significant risks. But 4 soldiers were missing, and the military doesn't abandon its own. Hayes authorized an immediate reconnaissance mission, to be followed by a full search operation if necessary. Lieutenant Thomas Bradley led the initial search team, accompanied by 2 experienced mountain warfare specialists and a radio technician. They carried emergency medical supplies, additional radio equipment, and enough provisions for a week-long operation. Their orders were simple: reach Observation Post Charlie, determine the status of the 4-man team, and report back immediately. The search team departed at dawn on December 6th, exactly 1 day before Pearl Harbor would change the course of American history. They followed the same route Romano's team had taken 3 weeks earlier, but the landscape had been transformed by winter's grip. What had been a challenging but manageable trail was now a treacherous path through deep snow and ice-covered rocks. Progress was painfully slow. Conditions that had allowed Romano's team to cover 12 miles on their first day now required an entire day just to traverse half that distance. The searchers took turns breaking trail through snow that reached their waists in some areas. Every step required careful attention to avoid hidden crevasses or unstable snow bridges. By nightfall, they'd covered less than 8 miles. Bradley's radio report back to base was sobering. The weather was deteriorating rapidly, with heavy snow beginning to fall and temperatures dropping below zero. Wind speeds were increasing, creating dangerous whiteout conditions that made navigation nearly impossible. The search team established an emergency shelter and waited for morning, hoping conditions would improve. Instead, December 7th brought the worst blizzard the region had seen in decades. Visibility dropped to mere feet, and the wind created drifts that buried their equipment and threatened to overwhelm their shelter. Bradley made the difficult decision to abort the mission and return to base. The retreat took 2 full days of dangerous travel through conditions that claimed the life of one searcher when he fell through thin ice crossing a snow-covered stream. The surviving team members reached base camp on December 9th, frostbitten and exhausted. Their report was devastating, reaching observation post. Charlie, under current conditions, was impossible without significant risk of additional casualties. Meanwhile, the attack on Pearl Harbor had thrown the entire military into chaos. Resources that might have been dedicated to the mountain search were suddenly needed for coastal defense and war preparations. The 4 missing soldiers became a low priority in the face of a national emergency that demanded immediate action. Additional search attempts were planned but repeatedly postponed due to weather conditions that seemed to worsen with each passing week. January 1942 brought record snowfalls that made the mountain passes completely impassable. February offered no improvement, with temperatures remaining well below normal and additional storms dumping fresh snow on already impossible terrain. By March, when conditions finally began to moderate, the snowpack in the high country was measured at over 20 feet deep. Even experienced mountaineers declared the area inaccessible until late summer at the earliest. The 4 soldiers of observation post Charlie had been missing for 4 months, buried somewhere beneath an ocean of snow and ice. Spring brought renewed hope and a more systematic search effort. As snow began to melt in the lower elevations, search teams could finally access the outer approaches to the observation post location. Aircraft were deployed to scan the area from above, looking for any signs of the missing team or their equipment. What they found was a landscape scoured clean by winter's fury. The small meadows and clearings that had been visible in November were now filled with massive snowdrifts and debris from avalanches. Rock slides had altered the terrain in several areas, and entire sections of the original trail had been washed out by spring flooding. Ground teams reached the approximate location of Observation Post Charlie in late June 1942, 7 months after the team's disappearance. What they discovered was both heartbreaking and puzzling. The site where Romano had established their camp showed clear signs of recent habitation, but the evidence was confusing and incomplete. Scattered equipment was found buried in snow and debris. A damaged radio antenna, pieces of military canvas, empty food containers, and personal items, including a pair of broken eyeglasses and a waterlogged notebook. But there were no bodies, no clear indication of what had happened to the 4 men, and no signs of their shelter or primary equipment. The official investigation concluded that the team had likely been caught in an avalanche or severe storm, with their remains buried beneath tons of snow and rock. The scattered equipment suggested they'd attempted to abandon their position, possibly during a weather emergency, but had been overwhelmed by conditions before they could reach safety. Families were notified that their sons and husbands were presumed dead, killed in the line of duty during a classified military operation. Small memorial services were held, flag-draped coffins containing only personal effects were buried in hometown cemeteries, and the 4 soldiers joined the growing list of World War II casualties. But questions lingered among those who had known the men personally. Romano was too experienced to be caught off guard by weather. Chen had grown up in these mountains and understood their dangers. Henderson was too disciplined to abandon proper radio protocols without good reason. And Kowalski was too skilled a marksman to leave equipment behind without cause. Some investigators privately suspected that the scattered equipment had been deliberately placed, possibly to create the impression of an accident. The notebook found at the scene contained entries that seemed inconsistent with the timeline of the team's disappearance. References to events that should have occurred after their last radio transmission raised uncomfortable questions about what had really happened during those final days. Military records from the period were classified and remained sealed for decades. The family's requests for additional information were denied, and speculation about the team's fate was discouraged. The official story remained unchanged. 4 soldiers had died in a weather-related accident while performing their duty in a remote mountain location. Over the following decades, occasional hikers and climbers reported finding pieces of military equipment in the area. A corroded helmet here, a piece of canvas there, fragments of what might once have been part of a larger story. But these discoveries were isolated and provided no new insights into what had actually happened to the 4-man observation team. The area around Observation Post Charlie became something of a legend among local mountaineers. Some claimed to have seen strange lights in the mountains during winter storms. Others reported finding campsites that showed signs of recent use but contained no modern equipment. A few swore they'd heard radio transmissions in an old military code, broadcasting from locations where no stations were supposed to exist. These stories were dismissed as typical mountain folklore, the kind of tales that grow around any location associated with mystery or tragedy. But they persisted, passed down through generations of climbers and outdoor enthusiasts who knew the mountains intimately and insisted something unusual had happened in that remote corner of the Cascades. Military historians occasionally revisited the case, particularly as classified documents from the World War II era were gradually declassified. But the files related to Observation Post Charlie remained frustratingly incomplete. Key reports were missing, radio logs had gaps, and witness statements contained contradictions that couldn't be resolved with available evidence. The 4 soldiers gradually faded from public memory, their names added to war memorials alongside thousands of other young men who died serving their country. Romano, Henderson, Kowalski, and Chen became statistics in the vast accounting of World War II casualties, their individual stories lost in the larger narrative of global conflict and national sacrifice. By the 1980s, the case had become little more than a footnote in military archives. The families who had once demanded answers were aging or gone, and the few surviving relatives had accepted the official explanation of a weather-related tragedy. The mountains had claimed 4 young soldiers, just as they had claimed countless others over the decades. Case closed. But the mountains keep their secrets differently than bureaucrats keep files. What had been buried under tons of snow and ice wasn't lost forever. It was preserved, waiting in a frozen time capsule that would eventually reveal truths no one expected to find. Climate change began altering the Cascade snowpack in ways that hadn't been seen for centuries. Winters that once brought 20-foot drifts now barely managed half that accumulation. Glaciers that had existed since the last ice age started retreating at alarming rates. And in the high country around what had once been Observation Post Charlie, decades of accumulated snow and ice began to melt away. The first hint that something extraordinary was waiting to be discovered came in 2009. A group of geology students conducting research on glacial retreat photographed what appeared to be artificial structures emerging from a receding ice field. The images were unclear, taken from a distance, but they showed geometric shapes that didn't belong in the natural landscape. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the professor leading the research team, filed a report with the Forest Service noting the unusual formations. But budget constraints and competing priorities meant no immediate investigation was launched. The photographs were filed away, another piece of documentation in an endless bureaucratic process that moved at geological speed. 3 years later, a solo climber named Mark Hendricks was attempting a winter ascent of an unnamed peak when he noticed something glinting in the afternoon sun. Investigating closer, he found what appeared to be metal debris embedded in the ice. The pieces were clearly man-made, but their purpose wasn't immediately obvious. Hendricks photographed his discovery and posted the images on a mountaineering forum, asking if anyone could identify the objects. The response was immediate and intense. Military history enthusiasts recognized the distinctive shape of World War II-era equipment. Speculation ran wild about crashed aircraft, lost supply drops, and forgotten military operations. But no one connected the discovery to 4 soldiers who had vanished 70 years earlier. Word of the find reached retired Army Colonel James Patterson, who had spent decades researching unsolved cases from World War II. Patterson recognized something in Hendricks's photographs that others had missed. The equipment bore markings consistent with gear issued to observation teams in 1941. More importantly, the location matched coordinates he'd found buried in declassified reports about missing personnel. Patterson contacted Dr. Mitchell, sharing his suspicions about what might be hidden in the ice. Together, they petitioned the Forest Service for permission to conduct a proper archaeological investigation. The process took 2 years, but in 2014 they received authorization to explore the site systematically. The initial expedition in summer 2014 was limited by budget and weather, but it confirmed that significant artifacts were preserved in the ice. Military equipment, personal items, and what appeared to be structural remains were all visible beneath the translucent frozen surface. The team documented everything they could reach safely, but the most promising discoveries remained locked in ice too thick to penetrate with available tools. Funding for a full excavation came from an unexpected source. The families of the 4 missing soldiers had established a memorial foundation decades earlier, and that foundation still maintained an account specifically designated for any future search efforts. Combined with grants from historical preservation societies and military research organizations, enough money was raised to mount a proper expedition. The 2015 team included archaeologists, military historians, mountaineering specialists, and representatives from the families. They brought ground-penetrating radar, ice-melting equipment, and preservation materials designed to protect any artifacts they might recover. Weather windows in the high country are always brief, but they had a solid month to work before winter conditions would force them to retreat. What they found in those first weeks exceeded everyone's expectations. The ice had preserved not just equipment, but an entire military installation. Tents were still standing, their guy lines taut and their fabric intact after 74 years of burial. Inside, sleeping bags were laid out as if their occupants had just stepped outside for morning duties. The radio equipment was exactly where Henderson would have positioned it for optimal transmission. His logbook sat open beside the transmitter, the final entry, dated December 3, 1941. The handwriting was clear and professional, documenting routine observations with no indication of impending disaster. Personal belongings told individual stories of the 4 men who had lived and worked in this frozen tomb. Romano's service revolver was found in its holster, properly maintained and ready for use. Kowalski's rifle was positioned in the observation blind, zeroed and loaded, pointing toward a valley approach where he'd been watching for threats that never materialized. Chen's medical supplies were organized with the precision that had made him such an effective field medic. Bandages, medications, and surgical instruments were arranged in a portable kit that could be deployed instantly in an emergency. A half-written letter to his family in Seattle was found among his personal effects, describing the beauty of the mountain landscape and his confidence in their mission's success. Henderson's radio repair tools were laid out beside the main transmitter, suggesting he'd been working on equipment maintenance when something interrupted his routine. Technical manuals were open to pages describing cold weather operation procedures, and his personal effects included the engagement ring he'd planned to give Mary upon his return. But the most remarkable discovery was the shelter itself. Hidden beneath the military tents was a structure that defied everything investigators thought they knew about the team's final days. Built from local materials and military supplies, it was clearly designed for long-term habitation. Stone walls provided wind protection, while ingenious ventilation systems prevented carbon dioxide buildup. Food storage areas were organized to maximize their limited supplies, and sleeping areas were arranged to conserve body heat efficiently. This wasn't the camp of soldiers preparing to evacuate due to weather. This was the home of men who had settled in for an extended stay, who had adapted to their environment, and were prepared to survive indefinitely. The evidence suggested they had lived in this location far longer than anyone had suspected, possibly through the entire winter of 1941 to 42. The mystery deepened when investigators discovered a second radio hidden in the main shelter. This wasn't military-issue equipment, but a civilian receiver capable of monitoring multiple frequencies. Beside it was a notebook filled with intercepted transmissions, decoded messages, and intelligence reports that had never been forwarded to military headquarters. The intercepted communications painted a picture of intelligence gathering that went far beyond the team's original observation mission. They had been monitoring Japanese radio traffic, tracking submarine movements along the Pacific coast, and documenting aerial reconnaissance flights that preceded the Pearl Harbor attack by several weeks. Among Chen's possessions, investigators found detailed maps of the coastline marked with landing sites, defensive positions, and strategic targets. These weren't military-issued maps, but hand-drawn documents that showed an intimate knowledge of enemy planning that shouldn't have been available to a four-man observation team. The implications were staggering. Either these soldiers had discovered intelligence information on their own initiative, or their mission had been far more complex than official records indicated. The classified nature of their assignment suddenly made more sense if they had been gathering information about imminent enemy action rather than simply watching for routine threats. Henderson's radio logs contained transmissions that weren't found in any military archives. Coded messages sent to frequencies that didn't correspond to known Army communications networks. References to contacts and operations that weren't documented in official files. And most disturbing of all, requests for extraction that had apparently been denied or ignored. The final entries in the team's documentation were dated in early February 1942, nearly 3 months after their last official radio contact. They had survived the brutal winter that had claimed the life of one searcher and prevented any rescue attempts. They had maintained their mission, continued gathering intelligence, and sustained themselves in conditions that should have been fatal. But something had gone wrong in those final weeks. The last entries in their logs became increasingly desperate, documenting dwindling supplies, equipment failures, and growing isolation. Chen's medical notes indicated that at least one team member was suffering from severe frostbite and possible pneumonia. Food rationing had become critical, and fuel supplies were nearly exhausted. The most haunting discovery was Romano's final report, written in pencil on the back of a supply requisition form. It was addressed to his commanding officer, but never transmitted due to radio failure. In it, he described their situation with the calm professionalism that had defined his military career. But the content was devastating. They had intercepted Japanese communications indicating a major offensive was planned against the West Coast. Submarine activity had increased dramatically, and aerial reconnaissance flights were probing American defenses on a daily basis. The intelligence they had gathered could potentially save thousands of lives, but their radio had failed during a storm in January, cutting off their communication with the outside world. Romano's report detailed their attempts to reach civilization on foot, but deep snow and extreme weather had made travel impossible. Chen was treating cases of advanced frostbite and malnutrition. Kowalski had developed a persistent cough that suggested pneumonia. Henderson had injured his leg during a fall while attempting to repair their antenna system. They were dying slowly in their mountain fortress, surrounded by intelligence that could change the course of the war, but unable to communicate with anyone who could act on the information. Romano's final words were a request that their families be told they had died serving their country, performing a mission that mattered more than their individual survival. The archaeological team worked in shifts around the clock, knowing their window of opportunity was closing as winter approached. Every artifact was carefully documented, photographed, and preserved. The shelter was mapped in precise detail, creating a three-dimensional record of how 4 soldiers had adapted to survive in one of the most hostile environments on the continent. But questions remained that no amount of archaeological evidence could answer. Why had their intelligence reports never been forwarded to higher command? Who had authorized their extended mission beyond the original timeline? And most importantly, why had no serious rescue attempt been made until it was too late to save their lives? The answers to those questions began emerging when Dr. Mitchell's team discovered something that changed everything they thought they knew about the 4 soldiers' fate. Hidden beneath Romano's final reports was a collection of documents that had been wrapped in waterproof military canvas and carefully sealed with wax. The preservation was so complete that the papers looked like they'd been written yesterday. Inside were detailed intelligence summaries that painted a chilling picture of what the team had actually discovered in those mountains. They hadn't just been monitoring for potential threats. They had stumbled upon evidence of an active Japanese intelligence network operating along the Pacific Northwest coast. Submarine landing sites, supply caches, and communication networks that had been established months before Pearl Harbor. Chen's fluency in Japanese had proven invaluable in decoding intercepted transmissions. His translations revealed plans for sabotage operations targeting Boeing aircraft factories, shipyards in Seattle, and strategic bridges throughout the region. The 4 soldiers had uncovered a conspiracy that reached far beyond their original observation mission, but the most shocking discovery was a handwritten letter from Colonel Hayes, dated January 15, 1942. The letter, addressed to Romano personally, revealed that military command was fully aware of the team's situation. They knew about the intelligence gathering, the extended mission timeline, and the desperate conditions at Observation Post Charlie. Hayes' letter was brutally honest about the impossible choice facing military leadership. The intelligence the team had gathered was critical to defending the West Coast. But extracting them would require a major operation that could compromise their position and alert enemy agents that their network had been discovered. The 4 soldiers were being asked to continue their mission indefinitely, knowing it would likely cost them their lives. Romano's response, found in the same sealed packet, demonstrated the kind of courage that defined the greatest generation. He acknowledged the impossible situation and accepted the assignment extension without complaint. But he made one request that revealed the depth of his leadership and humanity. He asked that if they didn't survive, their families be told they died in a routine weather accident, not in a classified operation that would remain secret forever. The radio specialist Henderson had managed to maintain intermittent communication with headquarters throughout January and February 1942. But these transmissions were being conducted on frequencies so classified that no record of them existed in standard military archives. His final transmission, dated February 28, 1942, was a single coded message: "Mission accomplished. Recommend immediate action on intelligence provided. Personnel status critical." The response came 3 days later, the last official communication the team would receive. It was a brief acknowledgement that their intelligence had been received and was being acted upon. Japanese sabotage networks throughout the Pacific Northwest were quietly dismantled in a series of operations that prevented catastrophic damage to American war production. Submarine bases were raided, communication networks disrupted, and dozens of enemy agents captured or eliminated. The 4 soldiers in their frozen mountain post had single-handedly uncovered and helped dismantle one of the most sophisticated enemy intelligence operations on American soil. Their sacrifice had potentially saved thousands of lives and protected critical military infrastructure during the most vulnerable period of America's entry into World War II. But the cost was devastating. Medical supplies had been exhausted by early March. Food rationing had become so severe that the men were consuming barely 800 calories per day. Fuel for heating was nearly gone, and temperatures in the shelter were dropping to dangerous levels, even with body heat conservation techniques. Chen's medical logs from the final weeks made for heartbreaking reading. He documented the progressive deterioration of his teammates with clinical precision, noting symptoms of advanced malnutrition, hypothermia, and respiratory infections that he was powerless to treat without proper supplies. His own condition was equally dire, but his entries remained focused on caring for others until the very end. Kowalski's marksmanship skills had evolved into something else entirely during those final months. His observation logs showed he'd developed an almost supernatural ability to detect movement and identify threats across vast distances. Even while weakened by hunger and cold, he maintained vigilant watch over their position, documenting wildlife patterns and weather changes with obsessive detail. The most poignant discovery was Henderson's personal diary, separate from his official radio logs. In it, he wrote letters to Mary that he knew would never be sent, describing the beauty of the mountain landscape and his growing understanding of what their sacrifice meant. He wrote about watching sunrises from their observation post, about the way moonlight reflected off the snow, about the profound silence that existed in places untouched by civilization. His final entry was dated March 15, 1942. If someone finds this someday, tell Mary I kept my promise. I said I'd come back by Christmas, and I will. Just not the Christmas I was thinking of. Tell her the ring is in my pack, and that every day up here I thought about the life we were going to build together. Tell her I'm not sorry about staying. Some things are bigger than one person's happiness. Romano's leadership during those final weeks was evident in every document and artifact the team discovered. He'd maintained discipline and morale under impossible conditions, ensuring that each man continued performing his duties even as their situation became hopeless. His final duty roster, dated March 20, 1942, showed he was still organizing shifts for observation and equipment maintenance when most commanders would have declared the mission impossible to continue. The end, when it came, was both peaceful and heartbreaking. Chen's final medical entries described a gradual weakening that claimed each man in turn. Romano was the last to succumb, maintaining watch over his fallen comrades until exhaustion finally overwhelmed him. His body was found at the observation post, binoculars still in hand, facing west toward the valleys he'd protected until his final breath. 75 years after 4 young soldiers vanished into the Cascade Mountains, their story finally came to light. What began as a routine observation mission became something far more significant, a testament to courage, sacrifice, and duty that transcended anything their families could have imagined. Romano, Henderson, Kowalski, and Chen didn't just die in a weather accident. They gave their lives protecting a nation that would never know their names or understand the magnitude of their contribution. The intelligence they gathered, the enemy networks they helped expose, the sabotage operations they prevented, all of it remained classified long after their deaths. Their families buried empty coffins and mourned sons and husbands they believed had died in vain, victims of bad weather and worse luck. The truth was infinitely more profound. These 4 men, isolated in a frozen fortress at 7,200 feet above sea level, had become an intelligence operation that changed the course of America's entry into World War II. Their willingness to continue their mission, knowing it meant certain death, represented the kind of sacrifice that built the foundation of victory in the Pacific. The discovery of their shelter didn't just solve a 75-year-old mystery. It revealed heroes who had been forgotten by history, men who chose duty over survival when the stakes couldn't have been higher. Their story reminds us that the greatest acts of courage often happen in silence, witnessed only by mountains that keep secrets better than any government archive. In the end, Henderson did keep his promise to Mary, just not in the way anyone expected. He came home when the ice finally released him, when climate change melted away the frozen tomb that had preserved their sacrifice for 3/4 of a century. The engagement ring was still in his pack, waiting alongside the stories of 4 soldiers who proved that some missions are worth any price. Their names are now etched in granite at Arlington National Cemetery, no longer missing in action, no longer forgotten. The mountain that claimed their lives also preserved their legacy, ensuring that someday someone would find them and tell the world about 4 young men who saved countless lives by choosing to stay when they could have tried to leave. Sometimes the greatest discoveries aren't about what we find, but about understanding that heroism comes in forms we never expect, hidden in places we never think to look.